Dear eligible U.S. citizens, please vote for Joe Biden. Sincerely, everyone with a conscience. As for the topic at hand, gosh, the word mask hits different in 2020. Last Friday, I did a double feature of two recent zombie movies. First up was Il Cho's #Alive, which is available on Netflix, and then I immediately jumped into Abe Forsyth's Little Monsters, which is on Hulu. They are radically different takes on the genre, with the former being a more traditional horror action drama type deal, while the latter is a horror comedy. But one key difference that really stuck out was how each did or didn't acknowledge the audience's existing understanding of The Walking Dead. And this is a storytelling question I think a lot about. It's 2020. People know how zombies work. Sure, there are tweaks to the formula that should be clarified. #Alive's zombies run while Little Monsters shamble. But the fundamentals are the same. They're all hungry for human flesh, infect those they've bitten, and are very difficult to re-kill, generally requiring the destruction of the brain. This is true for both of those films, and pretty much every other one of the thousands that have been made since the Night of the Living Dead. And so when watching one of these films and hearing the news reports as chaos begins to descend on civilization, I always wonder if we're going to hear that Z word. If it is going to acknowledge that in reality, these people would understand what was happening. #Alive does not acknowledge that. The news reporters seem shocked and confused, and early on walk us through the bits of breaking news that are actually decades old, thanks. And while I guess it fits the tone of the film, it's also genuinely weird that our protagonist, who spends his days playing video games and owns multiple drones, doesn't know what a zombie is. Conversely, in Little Monsters, everyone does exactly what you would expect. They know what's up, but still freak out because zombies, y'all. And that seems to be primarily the purview of the more lighthearted side of horror, which I've always found a little bit odd. I've been trying to think of serious movies that have this sort of meta aspect, and there's Michael Haneke's classic 1997 home invasion thriller Funny Games, and Michael Haneke's classic 2007 home invasion thriller Funny Games. And is that it? Let me know in the comments below. But even within the broader horror comedy concept, there is still a wide variety of ways that these films approach the genre meta. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week Air Review. You can call me a former serial killer, LOL. And today, I am talking about Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. And if that sounds like the name of a documentary, you wouldn't be entirely off base. Scott Glosserman's 2006/7 slasher is, in part, a mockumentary. But I do need to clarify the in part thing, because while much, and perhaps even most, of the film exists diegetically captured run and gun by the journalism majors who decided to make a deal with the devil, there's a lot of it that doesn't. And to the film's credit, this isn't really a bait and switch. The very first scene looks like any other movie in the genre. A blonde teen in diner worker uniform comes out the back door bringing the garbage to the dumpster. A figure in the bushes. The door closes suddenly. She looks away, and then the figure is gone. Spooky. But then we switch to mockumentary mode. And it's a little jarring. We're walking talking with Taylor, a journalism student who is setting up her big school project. And here we learn something interesting about this world, as Taylor quite seriously tells us about the masked man who destroyed Camp Crystal Lake's chances of ever turning a profit, that other masked man who made Haddonfield a nightmare on Halloween, and that other man whose face may as well be a mask, making the dreams of those living in Springwood deadly. And now there's a new man looking to make a supernatural name for himself, the subject of their documentary, Leslie Vernon. This all sets up Behind the Mask as something fundamentally different from other meta slashers. Typically in these stories, the horror canon exists in film form, and characters will make references to specific movies and characters that everyone knows are fictional. Here, that canon exists in history books. And this isn't an academic difference. It completely changes the way that the film comments on the tropes of its subgenre. And it means that Behind the Mask has more in common with Cabin in the Woods on a philosophical level than it does Scream. Rather than rolling its eyes at the ridiculousness of how characters act in slasher movies, Behind the Mask subverts expectations by justifying them. Just as Cabin in the Woods uses dumb gas to make smart people go off alone to their deaths, Behind the Mask shows Leslie fabricating news clippings, connecting his tragic backstory to that of his final girl, Kelly, and leaving them in a place where she can't help but find and dig into them. And of note, Kelly is not referred to as a final girl, but a survivor girl, which I initially found distracting but accepted because it's a useful example of the differences between our world and the films. Since these masked monsters are actually real, there's not going to be the same kind of discourse around them, so Carol J. Clover would never have written Men, Women, and Chainsaws, where the term was coined. When Leslie says survivor girl, he's not quoting a critical text. It's either a term he came up with or one that is accepted within the film's murder community, which is hinted at through Leslie's relationship with an aged-out slasher, Eugene, who we first meet as he is dug up from a sensory deprivation tank where he is continuing to practice dropping his heart rate to near zero so that the unsuspecting teens think he's dead, until suddenly the body's gone. When I saw that Robert Englund, Mr. Freddy Krueger himself, had a part in the film, I figured it might be a role like that. But instead, Englund serves as the Dr. Loomis analog named after The Shining's resident Shining-splainer Dick Halloran, a character Leslie and Eugene excitedly refer to as an Ahab. And while Englund's clearly having a great time and is a lot of fun, it does feel like a missed opportunity. I think the idea of a mockumentary about a slasher-type serial killer is an interesting one, but it's a fine line to walk. You want to give audiences a look into their mind, but not make them seem heroic or sympathetic. Like most folks, I wasn't a fan of that 2000s mentality of, oh, all these famous monsters need to have traumatic childhoods, perhaps best exemplified by Rob Zombie's Halloween remake, which came out a year after Behind the Mask's South by Southwest debut. Leslie Vernon barely has a backstory, and he is not presented as anything other than the psychopath he is. However, psychopaths are often charming, and Leslie is no different, especially since he looks a whole lot like Psycho-era Anthony Perkins. And that creates an interesting tension with the journalism students documenting him. Taylor and her cameramen, Todd and Doug, will periodically pause to consider what they've gotten themselves into and how deep they're willing to go, because, they're ostensibly facilitating the deaths of a bunch of innocent kids. And that's gonna weigh on a person. There's no attempt to dissect the big picture questions about the ethical requirements of journalists documenting tragic events, but that's really for the best. Instead, it is fairly straightforward drama, and it works. Which brings us back to the issue of it only sort of being a mockumentary. For most of that drama, we are seeing things from Todd and Doug's cameras, whereas most of the spooks, we aren't. And let's be honest, it is totally a cop-out, a statement from the creative team that they felt they couldn't make the mockumentary aesthetic work from start to finish, so they weren't even going to try. Interestingly, this just predated the found footage craze that really kicked off in 2007, and I expect that if Behind the Mask had been made after the release of Rec, Paranormal Activity, Cloverfield, etc., it probably would have been different, even though those aren't slasher films themselves. Like, there would be a scene where Taylor shouts at Doug or Todd asking, "Why are you still filming?" And they'd be like, "We don't know," but a cleverer version of that. The real issue with the shift between styles is that it simply becomes less interesting when it's yet another slasher film. Sure, it's fun to watch the big climactic last stand against the monster play out when you have seen him talk through the plan and when some of the folks were there for that planning sesh, but that's where that ends. They say limitation breeds creativity, right? That's why The Exorcist director William Friedkin says he doesn't watch new movies, because they aren't good anymore since the advent of CGI has removed limitations from creative expression, which, ugh. Also, he's a Woody Allen sympathizer. Fuck that guy. But it's not nearly that simple. And when Behind the Mask removes its stylistic limitation, we are faced with its much more obvious budgetary limitation. And there's nothing particularly creative about what results from that. Leslie's weapon of choice is a sickle, representing his true meaning as a working-class symbol who will rise up against the capitalist pigs represented by these carefree teens. With his weapon, he will remove the heads from the bourgeoisie and start a revolution that will take down the billionaire class and bring forth a new era of communal prosperity and togetherness. And for that, comrade, we salute you. Probably. But unfortunately for all of us, the sickle isn't used to particularly good effect. Not because it fails to bring down capitalistic oppression, though that is true, but because the kills themselves are kind of uninspired. Like, I don't know. I expect modern movies to at least have more technically complex deaths than the original Friday the 13th. And this doesn't. There's no big, whoa, I can't believe they just did that. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, that was fine, I guess. The closest they come to something unique is a farm tool explicitly called out as being prepped for mayhem, but the payoff there is lacking at best. The scenes aren't bad, but I've already forgotten basically all of them, and I watched this movie a few days ago. Heck, I genuinely don't know if the person who was supposed to be Leslie's first victim was actually killed, or if she just fainted from spooks or whatever. I wanted more. Nay, needed it. Even if Behind the Mask is more concerned with deconstructing the genre than replicating it, it still needs to hit the basic pleasure center that slashers do. And it only kind of does. Which is part of why it's better when it sticks to the mockumentary aesthetic. Because you can't think, oh, this is just like that one part in that one movie, but not as good. It forces situations to play out and present differently. By far, my favorite part of the entire film comes as Leslie finally gets to work. Everyone is standing in a room as he psychs himself up, says goodbye, and then he walks out. But the camera crew stays behind, and us with them. As the sounds of cutting and screaming come through the wall, we watch whatever fantasy Taylor and co. had been telling themselves about the moral ambiguity of their project come crashing down. And it's awesome. Really, really awesome. And it only works because of the style in which it's presented. So when just a few minutes later that is dropped for the entire rest of the film, I was frustrated because I believed that there was a way they could have kept things going. And look, maybe Glosserman and co. were just a few years too early to do something like what Gareth Evans and Timo Gianto did with their VHS 2 segment Safe Haven. Maybe camera tech just wasn't small or good enough to cover the kids in lenses so that they could get whatever angles they needed even after the point it made sense to keep filming. But I wanted to stay in that documentary as long as possible because that's really where Behind the Mask shines. 6.9 out of 10. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hammer and Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, @BlasianFMA, Magnolia Denton, and Elliot Fowler. If you like this video, it's great. If not, I'm sorry. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you in the next one.